Hello and good afternoon. This is Dr. Jason Dean with Revolution Health. We are back for another awesome episode and interview today, and I got her back. I'm so excited. Dr. Stephanie Seneff, pleasure to see you again, ma'am. Good afternoon.
Great to be back. Thank you.
And she's in Hawaii, where she's much smarter there.
That's kind of true.
she's staying away from crazy mainstream American soil where we do crazy things. And I've been to Hawaii once, and it was so much more beautiful out there. So I hope you're enjoying it out there.
I certainly am.
Absolutely. Excellent. Well, I wanted to have you on, obviously, for many reasons. One, because you're a genius. You are literally at the forefront of this leaky gut issue because of the glyphosate and other things. And so I actually wanted to bring you on because there's a lawsuit going around right now that most Americans don't know. We talked a little bit before we started live today, is the fact that mainstream media is not covering this for obvious reasons. I actually had to go behind the scenes a little bit to get the information on this article that I wanted to cover with you, because no one's going over it, which obviously we understand that, they pay for the news to be on and everything else. So they're covering stuff up. But this article, I want to get your take on it. And then we're going to go into your breaking research announcement that you emailed me about that we want to cover. Okay.
Great. Sounds good.
Excellent. So the article actually comes from the Organic Consumers Association, which is organicconsumers.org. And they're literally out there trying to educate everyone on organic, also what Bayer/Monsanto is doing now. But Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's a big advocate for natural health, is actually at the trial. And again, they're not covering it. So himself, as well as another one you discussed a little bit before, are covering it. And interesting, I'm going to go through just a couple excerpts of this. Basically, Dwayne Johnson, who's suing Monsanto, which is a landmark case because Monsanto's never been sued like this before, based on saying his non-Hodgkin's lymphoma was caused by glyphosate. Not a shocker. But as it goes through, they're actually talking about the toxicology reports and the fact that basically Monsanto knew that glyphosate is a probable human carcinogen, and they brought in Dwayne Johnson's attorneys. They brought in another attorney who found evidence on this was actually in the documentation, and they were covering it up. So you know a little bit about this, but based on that and this finding, I guess you would say, from the actual trial, does that shock you? And kind of what's your take on the fact that they covered something up and we might actually know there's a carcinogen involved?
I mean, I've known that for quite some time. I worked with Anthony Samsel, and he had to work hard to get through the Freedom of Information Act, a huge pile of unsearchable documents from Monsanto, unpublished research documents going back to the 1970s, 1980s, when they went through the process of proving that glyphosate is safe. And he has rummaged through these things painstakingly, and he has found some very interesting reports coming out of Monsanto, where cases where only the exposed mice or rats got cancer. None of it. There are papers in which this is true, where the unexposed didn't get cancer, whereas the exposed did. And these are very rare cancers. So the fact that they're showing up at all is quite scary and disturbing. They also did a lot of tricks as far as pulling in, and we've talked about that in our papers. We published a paper on cancer, actually, glyphosate and cancer. And in that paper, he presented the results out of the Monsanto studies, showing these patterns of cancer showing up in the exposed animals. Another thing was that they found very low doses of glyphosate did peculiar things that higher doses did not do. And their solution was to never do experiments again with such low doses. They also probably figured out that it takes 3 months before you start to notice damage. Glyphosate is a slow kill. So they made a rule way back then that you only have to study for 3 months. If you don't see any toxicity by 3 months, you're good to go, because they knew the toxicity would come along at 4 months, which is what Seralini found out in his study on rats. He did a study with a low dose exposure of glyphosate to rats, and over their entire lifespan. And after 3 months, there was nothing wrong with those rats. He couldn't see anything obvious. And it took 4 months before he started to see patterns. By the end of the experiment, they had massive tumors. They had kidney problems, liver problems, reproductive problems. There were lots of things, a shortened lifespan that showed up over time. But it took time. And this is what's happening to us. We are slowly accumulating glyphosate in all our tissues, especially in our bone marrow, which I find really, really disturbing. And that's how you get something like non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, because those cells in the bone marrow which are the precursors to the lymphocytes, which is the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma comes out of those cells that start out in the bone marrow and become blood cells, leukocytes, white blood cells. And those cells are being affected by glyphosate in such a way as they're turning into cancer cells. And this is the part that I'm very excited about, because I've really made a breakthrough in my own studies. Just over the past month, I've been ferociously reading a whole set of papers on a certain space that is really, really working out. So I'm very excited about that. But I think non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is almost a no-brainer with respect to glyphosate in terms of my understanding of how it works, toxically, how its toxicity works.
Now, before we're going to dive in, because Dr. Seneff actually has breaking research evidence today, which is awesome. First time I think she's shared it, which is really cool. But before I dive into that, the next question, you mentioned the bone marrow, which is fascinating, because I actually am seeing, I think the public is seeing, but it's still being quiet, is the fact that you're seeing kids now come up with these really strange cancers, like the lymphomas and other things, and bone cancers. And what you just said triggers me to think, okay, wait, this glyphosate, autism is going up. Yes. So wait a second, now we have these other diseases possibly going up, which could be the direct correlation to the glyphosate.
I think so, yes. I think it's causing a huge list of diseases to go up dramatically, which they are. And so it's interesting that people say, correlation doesn't mean causation. They always say that. And yet you've got all these diseases going up dramatically, and that doesn't seem to bother people. This is what really fascinates me. It's like, okay, fine, we're just all getting sicker and sicker, but who cares about that? That's not a problem. Glyphosate can't be the cause, even though it perfectly matches all these diseases. I mean, it's just really strange to me that people don't grasp that. Give me something else. This is the one chemical used in agriculture that has gone up in usage exactly in step. And it's the one that's most pervasive, highest concentrations in the United States. We use more than anybody else. And we're sick. We're very sick. And they say, oh, Americans have been eating GMOs for forever and they're fine. And I'm like, what? They're fine? Are you kidding me? We're not fine.
We've been effectively brainwashed, and the majority, I mean, we as a country, which I echo this all the time, is, we're consuming 80% of the entire planet's opioids. Inflammation is skyrocketing, cancer is skyrocketing. So yeah, to say the correlation, it's not causation or whatever they want to throw out there, is just pure. I actually call them pseudoscience. They like to call natural health pseudoscience. I call them pseudoscience.
I know. Fake science is this term that's been thrown around, and each side sort of accuses the other side of fake science. And the public is completely confused. They don't know what to believe. They think they should believe their government, and that's a mistake, because they shouldn't. They really shouldn't.
Absolutely. So before further ado, I want to dive in, because I know you've been chomping at the bit for this information. We're talking glyphosate. We're talking glycine. Talk to us, tell us, and drop some knowledge on everyone listening, the new research and new information you have discovered, and just lay it on us.
Yeah, okay. So it's complicated science. I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible. But I want to start with the concept, which is certainly how we have to get past this concept before any of it works. Glyphosate substitutes for glycine during protein synthesis by mistake. This is crucial, and this is the thing I've been saying. Anthony and I have been writing papers. I've written papers with other collaborators as well. So I've published several papers, different diseases, ALS, anencephaly, which is a child born with no brain, kidney failure, individual deep dive papers on individual diseases showing how, if glyphosate substitutes for glycine, it totally explains the epidemic in those diseases. Gout is another one. So we've done several papers. Heart disease, diabetes, all of these things can be explained by glyphosate substituting for glycine during protein synthesis. So what does that mean exactly? Glyphosate is an amino acid, and so is glycine. Glycine is one of the critical coding amino acids that go into the assembly of proteins. Proteins are famously assembled as beads on a string, like paper dolls holding hands, through the DNA code. And the DNA code is this 4-letter code of the DNA chromosomes. So this is the genetic information that has this sequence of these 4 letters in different arrangements, and you peel them off 3 by 3 by 3, and every 3 are a code for a particular amino acid. It's quite an elegant, this is the famous Watson and Crick DNA code. Right. Most people should know about that, but I find people don't. It's quite surprising. Some people have not learned about that through their educational system, but whatever. So that's key. The system is assembling a protein, and the proteins are the workhorses of the body. They do everything. They do so many things. They're enzymes, they're transporters, they're ion channels, they're water channels. They're just doing an incredible number of different receptors, like LDL receptor for the serum LDL, which is the high cholesterol problem. All these things are workhorses of the body, very, very important for the body's function. Essential, absolutely essential. And So the glycine, so when the protein is being assembled and you see a particular code, say GGC, which is a code for glycine, you want to grab a glycine and put it into the paper doll chain. But by mistake, the machinery grabs glyphosate instead. And this is because glyphosate is a complete glycine molecule, except that it's got an attachment on its nitrogen atom. And that attachment does not disrupt, I believe it does not disrupt the shape that it can fit into. It can still fit into the socket of the protein that's going to put it into the chain. So in other words, the protein, it makes a mistake and it goes into the chain by mistake. This actually explains the way glyphosate disrupts the shikimate pathway extremely well. And that's the famous thing that glyphosate does that's safe because we don't have that pathway. I don't know if you've heard that story, but that's what Monsanto says. They've said it in court with this lawsuit that's going on. And everyone in the audience, I hope, knows that that's not true because our gut bacteria do have that pathway. They use it to make essential amino acids, the aromatic amino acids, which go into the proteins. So those become deficient if our gut microbes can't make them because of the shikimate pathway. Well, there's this enzyme in the shikimate pathway called EPSP synthase. And it has a particular shape that it forms like a cavity to fit snugly the substrate, which is PEP. So that it makes this shape, the PEP goes in there, and then that allows it to do the reaction. And that shape is very, very important so the PEP can fit. And papers have been written that say, yes, glyphosate disrupts this enzyme because it replaces PEP in that pocket. It goes in instead of PEP gets in the way. That's not true. What it really does is it replaces glycine in the actual protein. There's a glycine in that structure. And if you put glyphosate instead, you're going to stick a piece of glyphosate, that stuff that's attached to the nitrogen, is going to go into the pocket, and then the PEP won't fit. So it's a very different mechanism from what they say. And I know this is true because multiple species of plants and multiple species of microbes have independently found a solution to protect themselves from glyphosate. And that solution involves changing that glycine residue into alanine. They do a DNA code replacement, a mutation, a genetic mutation that replaces that glycine with alanine. And lo and behold, that protein is completely insensitive to glyphosate at all concentrations. And when you read the papers, you can tell they're kind of astonished at this. They say, well, how can this be? That it could be so effective that suddenly glyphosate doesn't fit at all. Well, that's because it's not glycine. The code is broken. Breaking the code prevents glyphosate from substituting for glycine in the protein. But it would have nothing to do with if glycine just had to come in. If glyphosate had to just come in as an independent molecule into that pocket, that would not have that behavior at all.
Now, does that also, I mean, that fundamentally, structurally changes the protein, which we're built of protein. So when our body regenerates, whether it's a cell or tissue, it has to do that through a protein synthesis. So you're changing our body's makeup.
Yes, and this is where the game starts, because once you accept that that's happening, which I have, then you can start looking at papers that talk about what glycine does, specifically in various proteins, proteins that have, and they can find out which glycines are essential. They do these wonderful studies where they align. There's a lot of work that's gone into where we are today. I believe the research that's published already proves that this is happening, just from the incredible success I've had in explaining the disease process of all these diseases that are going up. Each one of them I can explain beautifully by specific proteins that would be affected by glyphosate. So you find some very important protein, let's say myosin. Myosin is super important. It's a muscle protein. It's the most highest protein in muscle mass. It's the highest protein in muscles, most concentrated protein in muscles. It's also in the gut. And if you disrupt myosin in the gut won't be able to contract and you won't be able to push. You'll get constipation. Things will back up because your gut is paralyzed. And glyphosate was shown to paralyze the gut in a woman who drank it trying to kill herself, and she almost succeeded. But it paralyzed her gut. I think it's because glyphosate got into those myosin molecules. Myosin turns out to have, depending on how you count, 12 to 14 highly conserved glycines. That's because multiple versions of myosin produced by various species, you line them up and you see all of them have glycine here. All of them have glycine over here. That's how you know glycine is important to this protein. So this is a game they play to figure out which particular amino acids are super essential to be there. And then they can play another game to say, well, let's see what happens if we take this glycine out and replace it with alanine. Alanine is actually the simplest replacement, one extra methyl group. Glyphosate has a much bulkier attachment. It produces a negative charge. So it's a much more disruptive substitution. But if you take that glycine, a particular glycine in myosin at 699, and you swap it out for alanine, your protein is dead in the water. It can only contract by 1% capacity. So once you start sprinkling glyphosate in these various 12 to 14 essential glycines in myosin, you're going to cause myosin to not work. And,
Wow.
and that can eventually cause ALS, because once your muscles get contaminated with glyphosate,
Sure.
and they can't contract, then the nerves that are feeding the muscles have to give them more juice. It's like, come on, move already, and then they get burned out by neurotoxicity because they're trying to produce so much, receptor. They're trying to produce the neurotransmitters that are going to excite those muscles to contract. Neuroexcitatory toxins, basically.
So between the glyphosate and the vaccines, they have literally figured out a way to take control of the human body. I mean, I know it sounds conspiratorial and crazy, but really we work in that world. But we're trying to figure out we're trying to, pull this puzzle apart. And what you're saying is they literally can basically hijack the human body, which takes me back to the birth of a child. You now have a completely altered DNA and an altered protein buildup of a human body. That gets pretty scary.
Yeah, and then the thing is that I've learned recently is that glyphosate disrupts proteins, many proteins, involved in keeping away cancer. This is what I've just discovered recently. It's really, really amazing. The story is rather beautiful and rather elegant. And I'm still trying to remember all the details. So I've even got notes, because usually I know everything in my head, but this is so new that it's hard for me to remember everything, Anyway, so in terms of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and I said that glyphosate accumulates in the bone marrow, and that's where these white blood cells come out and they mature. They start out as stem cells in the bone marrow. Everybody knows stem cells are really wonderful, and they can turn into anything. They're what they call pluripotent.
Sure.
But on the other hand, if you have a tissue cell, like a liver cell, if it can revert back to a pluripotent state. It can become a stem cell, a sort of adult stem cell, through a process. And if it does that, it has it's a step towards cancer. So the interesting thing is that these very powerful stem cells, which can become anything, you can actually convert a mature cell back into a stem cell through a process. And that process often is a response to stress. And if you do that, now you've got the potential to produce cancer, because that cell will start just multiplying wildly. It sort of gives up on whatever it used to do. It's just like this baby cell that doesn't know how to do anything except copy itself. And it just keeps on copying itself to oblivion until you've got this big tumor. So that makes sense, right?
That makes sense. It's just scary.
Yeah, it's certainly scary. So you look at liver cancer. There was just a headline yesterday, I think, that liver cancer is going up dramatically. And liver, disease in general, fatty liver disease and cirrhosis and hepatitis, all these things are going up dramatically in a younger population, the young adults today in America. Doesn't surprise me at all, because, of course, the liver gets hit hard by glyphosate. And glyphosate disrupts the liver's ability to detox other things, because it disrupts these cytochrome P450 enzymes. Those enzymes have a motif that contains two highly conserved glycine residues. That's going to get messed up. They're not going to work. So that's another one where it's very clear. You could explain it. They've observed that they just suppress these enzymes. You can explain it through glycine substitution. Once the liver can't detox, and glyphosate has been shown to induce oxidative stress in the liver. Oxidative stress is what causes these cells to potentially get into this cancerous state, because it's going to disrupt the DNA. You start to get DNA breaks. And there's a thing called double-strand breaks, and people know very well that double-strand breaks is a precursor to cancer. And multiple studies have shown that glyphosate causes double-strand breaks in people who've been exposed occupationally, or children, who live in these little villages that are surrounded by these GMO crops. People who have had significant exposure to glyphosate, there are studies that have shown there's a 1.6. There was one of the studies had a 1.6. So a 60% increased risk to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma among these agricultural exposed people in a study that was done in the United States. There's been a study done in Canada, and at least two in the United States. There's things coming out of South America. I mean, this is being shown. Glyphosate causes oxidative stress, and it causes double-strand breaks in the DNA. Those two things are very important. The oxidative stress, essentially the oxidation damage, is what can cause the DNA to get broken, so that all goes together. And
wow.
Yeah, and so it gets even more interesting, because the oxidative stress can be caused by cytochrome C oxidase, which has an essential glycine in something called an oxyanion hole. If that glycine is disrupted, then this is in the mitochondria, which produce ATP with this cytochrome C oxidase. If that thing is busted, first of all, that is going to start releasing superoxide, and it's not going to be able to convert oxygen to water. So it's going to mess up that enzyme in such a way that the mitochondria, instead of producing ATP, they produce superoxide, which is toxic.
Wow.
That's going to give you mitochondrial dysfunction, deficiencies of energy in the cell. That'll give you things like exhaustion, physical exhaustion, because your cells cannot produce enough energy because their mitochondria are broken by glyphosate.
It's almost as if they have found the perfect chemical that is doing its work behind the scenes almost, and it took this much research to get it done. And I'm just looking at future generations and how this plays out. And then from a vitamin standpoint, we've talked in past episodes. Morley Robbins has been on with me and talking about the importance of retinol and finding that information. Now, from a vitamin standpoint, whether it's retinol or anything else, are you seeing the breakdown of that as well, of the metabolizing of vitamins?
Absolutely. In fact, retinol is vitamin A is metabolized by cytochrome P450 enzymes in the liver, which are disrupted by glyphosate. So, and then vitamin A goes down these other paths and produces these toxic compounds. If you mess up the main path by which something is metabolized, all bets are off as far as where it's going to go, what it's going to produce. It's going to be these other chemicals that don't perform well in the body. And so vitamin D is also activated by cytochrome P450 enzymes. So you don't get vitamin D activation if they're busted. You get vitamin D deficiency, which has gone up dramatically, especially since 2007. That was when they introduced widespread use of glyphosate salts, and I suspect that might have something to do with it. I'm still trying to figure that out. But getting back to the cancer,
just down the whole machine. Go back to cancer. Yes,
the cancer just goes on and on, because I was like, okay, so fine, we've got this oxidative damage, we've got this DNA getting broken. How do we get from there to cancer? And that's where it gets really, really interesting, because there's a protein called AID, which was only discovered in 1998, activation-induced deaminase, discovered in 1998. And since then, I suspect the number of papers published on this protein have been going up exponentially, if you were to count in the literature, in the published literature, because it is very, very exciting. Lots of people are really interested in trying to figure out exactly what is the scope of its abilities and its ability to cause harm. It's really, really interesting. This protein is crucial for several things, one of which is to mature the immune system, like in the thymus when the baby's born. All these immune cells, it's a fascinating process by which the immune cells actually go through incredible mutations. They produce all kinds of different versions of themselves in a rich repertoire, and then various ones are pruned away because they might react with self. So it's a way of getting rid of all the ones that are too close. They're what they're going to recognize. These are like antigens, antigen antibody matches. These things are producing antibodies, also called immunoglobulins, which are going to match to antigens that are presented, such as food. When you get allergic to foods, you've got some kind of antibody that's becoming an autoantibody, like gluten intolerance. That's an example of an autoantibody that's gone wild and it starts attacking your own tissues. If you cannot perfect those antibodies, then they basically have poor vision. So they can't see. They might be looking for a virus, but they can't see it. Or they might be looking for a food protein like gluten, but they can't see it properly because they're not perfected properly, because AID is broken. So for example, if AID isn't working properly, the immune system will become deficient, and you will get both autoimmune disease and immune deficiency at the same time. Now, the other thing that AID does that's really fascinating is that it strips away the methyl groups to make a cell pluripotent. So it's really fascinating when in order for a cell to become a stem cell, the first thing it has to do is get rid of all the methyls that are attached to the DNA. It's really, really interesting. Strip away the methyls. And so methyls are sort of changing the DNA's activity. So you turn things on, turn things off with these methyls. And so this is what happens in an embryo when a fetus is just starting. First thing that happens is all the methyls get stripped out of the DNA in that fertilized egg. And then it can go on and put methyls back in certain ways to produce a new organism. So it's really, really important, those methyls. Stripping them away produces a stem cell-like behavior, which if you do that in a liver, you're going to end up with liver cancer. If you do that in an immune cell, you're going to end up with lymphoma, or leukemia, these kinds of blood diseases. And so AID, first of all, AID has 7 highly conserved glycine residues. And secondly, really, really interesting, AID has a strategy where it's activated by phosphorylation. So you attach these phosphates. So the body controls these, makes these proteins do different things, and the DNA do different things by adding these attachments like methyl groups and phosphates and sulfates. These things are added to change the behavior of these proteins. It's really, really interesting. If you add phosphate to AID, you turn it into, you give it the capability to cause double-strand breaks in DNA and to cause DNA hypomethylation, to take the methyl groups off, both of those things. And both of those things are essential for producing a cancer situation. So phosphorylation of AID will cause that, but phosphorylation works by providing negative charge. Phosphate is negatively charged. Mm-hmm. Glyphosate is also negatively charged. So if you put glyphosate in place of glycine in AID, you will act as if you have added a phosphate group. And it's actually been shown there's a particular form of AID that's produced by the zebrafish, which doesn't have this serine at the right spot. It can't be phosphorylated. And the researchers were like, what's up with that? This thing can't be phosphorylated. How come it works? It turns out it works constitutively as if it's phosphorylated, but it's not. And the reason is because it has another amino acid a couple doors down from that serine, that would be serine, that is a negatively charged amino acid. And by virtue of that negatively charged amino acid, it's permanently negatively charged, which is as if it's permanently phosphated. Mm. And this is what's going to happen to AID if you replace those glycines. With glyphosate, you're going to give it that negative charge. It's going to make it act as if it's permanently phosphorylated, which is going to cause it to behave in such a way as to break the DNA, produce these double-strand breaks, and then to strip off the methyl groups and to get the DNA ready to become cancer, make that cell into a stem cell. It's the initiating step towards stem cellness. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense to me. I mean,
I know it's hard science. I'm trying to make it as simple as possible.
And I totally get it. And I think a lot of people are going to go back through and watch this, and I'll probably watch this through it again. But I mean, even going back to the very end of what you just said, is the conclusion of that is getting to basically a stem cell that's non-operable and quote unquote could technically cause disease instead of causing the rebirth of cells in your body to regenerate. And that's really, I mean, all the science in the middle is fascinating to many of us and some people out there, but all you have to know is that stem cell, what we know about stem cells now, obviously it's very regenerative, it makes the body heal, but if you have a stem cell that's broken, because of that DNA broke, you have major problems right from the beginning.
Yes, and in fact, DNA repair is another issue, and I have to look this up. MRE11, I think it's called, a DNA repair enzyme. It has a glycine-arginine motif, a region that is thick with glycines and arginine, so lots of glycines in there. That motif controls its function. If you start throwing glyphosates into that motif, it won't work, and that is specifically repairing double-strand DNA breaks, which is what they're seeing in these studies on glyphosate. It's causing these double-strand breaks, probably through this process of disrupting the mitochondria and then disrupting AID. And so then you get this repair enzyme gets busted. You can't fix those double-strand breaks. That's what causes you then to go into this other mode where it becomes a cancer cell. It's a first step towards that.
Wow.
If you can't do the DNA repair. And that's also how you get mutations, by the way. Those repairs can screw up. So if you do a lot of DNA breaks and then you try to reassemble, fix things up, repair it, put it back together, which is really cool that these enzymes can do that. But they make mistakes when they do that. So when you have a lot of DNA breaks, you're going to have a lot higher risk of genetic mutation. And this really gets into a very interesting study that just came out. I was absolutely fascinated with it. It was on rats. And they exposed them. They were very carefully designed. They exposed the rat dam, the mom, pregnant. She was pregnant by 5 days. They were very careful to say, okay, she's pregnant 5 days later, start this glyphosate exposure. Low dose. It was below EPA's recommended level of daily exposure for these rats over a period of the entire pregnancy. And then I think a month into the period where she was nursing the pups. And so the pups are getting glyphosate only through the mom. They're not being directly exposed. And the mom didn't seem to have any problems at all. She seemed fine. And all the moms. The pups, they seemed pretty good too, but they had some issues with not being able to, they were partially infertile. They didn't produce as many pups as in the second generation as they should have. They seem to have some fertility issues. The second generation is where it gets interesting. because they had placental problems, like placental hypertension and enlarged placenta. They had slow growth in utero, so they had a small birth weight. Small birth weight. And then the really interesting thing is that some of them had, I think there were 3 very unusual deformities, that extremely rare deformities that showed up among 3 different moms. So 3 different first generation pups produced 3 offspring that had an extremely rare genetic mutation. Mm-hmm. And what this tells me is that glyphosate is accelerating the rate of mutation during reproduction. So the eggs and the sperm are getting heavily mutated by virtue of their exposure to glyphosate over the lifespan of the person. And I would imagine that if you have children later in life, you're going to have a higher risk of getting a deformed child simply because you've had longer exposure to glyphosate. It's going to cause your eggs and sperm to get mutated, which is going to cause these kinds of monster forms. And that's just, and you see that in South America. There's a documentary that just came out that I've watched called Genetically Modified Children, very aptly named. Mm. And they interviewed they got to know the farmers who were growing tobacco in, I think it's northern Argentina. And these farmers were required to use glyphosate-resistant tobacco. So there's a tobacco product that's resistant, seed that's resistant to glyphosate. They have to use that. They have to use glyphosate, or else Philip Morris will not buy their crop. And this is what came out in the movie. And then they had these children. They had several different children that they showed in this documentary who were they had very strange, severe genetic mutations that were causing severe disease. Very tragic. And so it's the same thing there is happening with the rats that were exposed in the experiment. And the glyphosate, and it's doing it to all of us. It's just doing it less because we're getting less exposure. We're going to all have, I think every generation is going to have a significant increase in the number of deformed children that are going to be produced. And also the fertility is going to get worse and worse.
Wow. And what was the name of that documentary again, so everyone can have that? Genetically
Modified Children.
I'm assuming we can find that probably on some of the apps like Netflix and places like that.
Yes, I've watched it. I bought it, and you can watch it streaming on Netflix. Very, very good movie. Very interesting. Very scary.
We'll try to, because that's not a shocker either. I mean, just to know what kids are eating today, what parents are eating today. I don't know if you know Pottinger's Cats, that book. I'm sure you've heard about that a little bit. But basically, Francis Pottinger found that, a long time ago, that even doing certain foods, processed foods, would, by the 3rd or 4th generation of the cats, would completely degenerate their bodies, no sexual function, infertile, even deviation, et cetera, things like that, which you're seeing.
I think that was probably taurine deficiency.
Yeah, you're seeing it play out in society today. So what you're doing is Dr. Seneff, you're the modern Dr. Francis Pottinger, but you're seeing the glyphosate play out generations later.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, if you start down this rabbit hole, it becomes very clear to you that this is what's happening. And then you're very surprised that other people don't notice it, because it's everywhere. Everything, I just so many situations where something bizarre is happening and people don't understand why. And they don't think to look at glyphosate because it's safe. And it's obvious that glyphosate is a major issue with, for example, the anencephaly in eastern Washington state, Yakima, Washington. They had an epidemic of anencephaly, which is a child born without a brain, in Washington state over a period of 2 years. And it was the same 2 years, and maybe with a little bit of a lag, where they were using a large amount of glyphosate to control runaway weeds in the waterways in that area. So the water supply, and also the water for irrigation, was going into the food, it was going into the water, was high because of using glyphosate in the waterways over those 2 years. And so they studied all kinds of things. They couldn't find what it was. Of course, they didn't look at glyphosate because it's safe. I mean, that's what always happens. They don't look at glyphosate because it's safe, even though it's the obvious thing that's causing the problem. It's so frustrating to me because it's so clear. And often, like on the farms, they can always say, well, it's not the glyphosate. You're exposed to all these other things, because usually on the farms they're using all kinds of chemicals, insecticides and fungicides, and then using glyphosate as an herbicide, maybe using some other herbicides too, because these days glyphosate doesn't necessarily work. So you've got that dicamba problem right now in the Midwest, where neighbors' farms are getting destroyed by the dicamba through drift. You know about that problem? There's all kinds of lawsuits and stuff.
Yeah,
this is going to be the future.
Is glyphosate affecting the DNA ligase 3? We've had a question on that because that's supposed to technically repair the double helix breaks. Do you see that that also affects?
I need to look. I haven't looked at that one.
Okay.
I just found this MRE. I'm just doing this now, and it's really quite a tedious process.
Yeah, I can imagine.
There's this huge number of proteins, and you say, well, maybe this one. Let me see if I can find anything. And then you start searching for glycine, glycine mutation. You can find cases where a person has a glycine mutation and they end up completely destroyed by it. I mean, you can have one single glycine in a protein like the calcium channel replaced by something else. In particular, I think there was a case where it was replaced by negatively charged bulkier amino acid, which is similar to glyphosate in those sort of physical properties. The child ends up with something called Timothy syndrome, which is like, you've got all kinds of metabolic issues, and you have, I think, seizures. You end up with high likelihood of autism. You die before the age of 5. I mean, it's just like a disaster with that one genetic mutation. So this is why you can find where glycines are super important by looking for genetic mutations where glycine is substituted for something else that causes some disease that's like, oh my God, this is amazing. And then once you see that, you say, well, then that calcium channel must be very, very important for something. And actually, calcium channels are one of the things that glyphosate induces. Glyphosate, in multiple cell types, they've shown that glyphosate causes calcium uptake by the cell. And calcium uptake induces phosphorylation. And so you're going to have a phosphorylation cascade, which is going to be more likely to end up with aid being phosphorylated, which is going to end up with this cancer path. And in fact, Anthony and I wrote in our first paper on glyphosate and as a glycine analog, which is our 5th in the series, glyphosate 5, we talked about kinases, which are proteins that add phosphate, and phosphatases, which are proteins that take it off. Both of them have essential glycines. And in the case of kinase, it was very clear. One paper talked about if you replace this particular essential glycine with a negatively charged amino acid, then it becomes more active. The thing that adds the phosphate becomes more active if it's replaced by glyphosate. Whereas for the phosphatase, the one that takes it off, it becomes less active. So you have increased activity of phosphate adding and decreased activity of phosphate taking off, which is going to end up with aid being hyperphosphorylated, which is going to end up with this path of the double-strand breaks and the methylation stripping off and the cancer, the stem cell and then the cancer. That's going to happen because of hyperphosphorylation of aid.
Wow. So Dr. Seneff showing us the correlation in a link, direct link between the glyphosate and the double-strand breaks, which comes to cancer. You have your non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So interesting information. What I'd like to have happen, Dr. Seneff, is if this trial is ongoing, obviously, it's not being covered by the media. There's very few of us out there who are knowing what's going on, reading the news behind the scenes. But as this plays out, I'd actually like to have you come back and go through. I'll get the information to you, send the links over to what the actual attorneys are saying for Monsanto, because they're literally saying things that are the opposite of what you're saying, and that's not surprising. They're covering their butts. It's a multi-trillion-dollar industry technically, but have you come back and actually go through how this thing plays out, and based on what you've seen in direct research, if that's okay. Right.
And I can tell you, Glyphosate Girl, I recommend that webpage.
Yeah, I'm going to reach out there as well.
She's doing great. She's been attending the meeting every day, which is very tedious, and she's been taking extensive notes. And then she's very colorful in her writing, and she does a good job of summarizing. She's got each day as a blog post. So every day she comes back and writes a blog. It's wonderful what she's doing, and I wish more people were doing that. But you can really go there as a first stop shopping if you want to learn what's going on day by day in the trial. Excellent. It's quite interesting.
Excellent. Well, thank you for being on the show today again. I really appreciate it. Your information is always priceless.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm going to drop your link below as well to people who can go who look up your research. You have a link out there, the direct link to her research, what she's doing. Like this page, obviously subscribe. There's also a podcast. Dr. Seneff's information is also on the podcast. We posted that, and the link is there as well. So we're getting your link out there so people can start looking at your research and educating themselves. So thank you once again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for being on Revolution Health today. We're signing off. Have a great afternoon, and please go educate on what she's saying. She is showing you the direct connection between this toxic poison that Monsanto/Bayer has created and how it's directly affecting not only us today, but how it's going back and affecting our DNA, and knowing going forward how we have to be with our children so this doesn't affect continued generations as it's going down to third and fourth generations. So signing off today from Revolution Health, Dr. Seneff and Dr. Jason Dean. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you very soon.
Thank you.